This conference will now be recorded.
You've now heard the American voice. Your words are going to be recorded for posterity. Good to see all of you again. Now, welcome. This is our first of what we're calling the DIGICORE Masterclass series. Just to remind you what these are. This is a sort of an introduction to a major topic that's likely to be important to your hospital, your research initiatives. To give you an overview of it, not necessarily take you into detail, we're pitching it so that people get a sense of what's the art of the possible in a topic. So if you were, for instance, if you're at a senior decision-making level in an R&D organization, it gives you a sense of what's the possibility. If you're heading up a cancer center, how can you mobilize your data for research? What's the role of those sorts of technologies? So that's the sort of where we're pitching it. And if you're a researcher, it kind of gives you the sort of an overview of the types of technologies and methods. Now, our first masterclass is on federation and federation technologies. These are the sort of privacy-conserving ways of sharing insights between cancer centers without sharing patient-level data. And I'm very, very pleased to announce a world-class lineup of speakers this afternoon. We'll be starting with Professor Andre Dekker from Maastricht University, kind of sort of spearheaded much of the work of this over the last 10, 15 years or so. He'll be presenting about what federation is all about. We'll be then going on to Stelios Theophanous, who'll be taking us through the AtomCap program, which is in anal cancer, so give you a sense of what the art of the possible is. And then Alberto Traverso, also at Maastricht, will give you a sense of what's possible in federated learning. I think that's going to be off imaging. So it'll be about 10 minutes on each. So you get us kind of a bit of an overview of what the art of the possible is, and that will leave us plenty of time for Q&A and follow up. How do we do it? What do we have to implement? Kind of what's the art of the possible? Those sorts of things. And a combination of James and myself will sort of facilitate that conversation. So with that, if I could ask you to keep yourselves on mute in case there's some background noise, unless you're a presenter. When we do questions, take yourself off mute again. But that's the plan. Give you a sense of an overview of where we're going, and welcome all. Great Friday afternoon. Kick you off. Great to introduce everyone. So Andre, over to you, and I will go on mute myself.
Yes, so good afternoon, everyone. Let me share my PowerPoint slide. Yes, here we go. Isabella, I saw your question. I'm sure if it's answered it, but yes, we are recording already this masterclass, so you should be able to see it. Thank you, Piers, for the introduction. So as I said, my name is Andre Dekker. I'm one of Maastricht Comprehensive Cancer Center, so one of the DIGICORE members. And I'm going to talk about federated learning, what it is and why I think at least it is important. I will be followed by Stelios, who is working in Leeds and has, together with us and some other DIGICORE members amongst, for instance, Oslo, has been working on anal cancer, as Piers said, and then Elby will talk about federated deep learning from images. Okay, so why is it important? Well, it's a very simple reason. The problem of health data, and including the data that we want to digitize in DIGICORE, our outcomes and cancer data, is spread around, right? And it's fragmented. We have about 150 million patients that get cancer every year in the world. As you can see in the middle, we collect quite a bit of data on those people, and that's a problem in itself, right? How do we handle all that amount of data? But what's more important is on the right that data is extremely fragmented. So, and we have to solve that issue. When the data is so fragmented and you ask people, well, why don't you just send me the data, right? Why don't you, send all the data, for instance, of Maastricht to IQVIA, and then they can analyze it for a question that they have? Well, then we run into a few problems, challenges, barriers. The first thing that people will tell you if you ask them to send me your data is that they say, well, I don't have the time for that, right? I need money, I need resources. It's a lot of work to get data out of your system and to another entity. The second thing people will say, well, I don't want you to have my data. I don't want a company looking at my data. I want another hospital looking at my data because you might find out that I'm doing something wrong. I want to keep control. I want to publish on my own data. Political reasons for people simply not wanting to share data. Then there's ethical reasons, right? Privacy reasons. People often say, well, GDPR, for instance, in Europe, is preventing me from sharing my data. That's not true. It takes a lot of work in GDPR. You may have to ask for consent, or you may have to de-identify anonymized data, but that's just resources and will. But still, the ethical argument is being used quite a bit to not share data. Technically, sharing data is not that difficult, right? We're streaming with 48 people at the moment, so this sharing of information and data I'm doing now is actually quite feasible. But these are the barriers that we are finding when we try to share data. And so in federated learning, what we're trying to do is another approach. If sharing of data is such a problem, then don't, right? Try to find a system where you don't need to share the data anymore. But then you have a mountain and Muhammad problem. If you can't bring all the data to, for instance, Maastricht, our research department, we have to bring our research questions to the data, right? So you have to switch it around. If you want to, of course, in the beginning, this meant a lot of traveling. So we spent, many of our researchers spent the world traveling, looking at other people's data in their hospital, but that doesn't scale well. And so federated learning tries to scale that. And we use a metaphor for that, which is based on trains. And so we say the research application, which is the question, right, that someone has on your data, we call it a train. And we have to have a way to send each other trains. So I have to be able to send Stelios has to be able to send a train to me in Maastricht and to the hospital in Oslo to ask his question about anal cancer, right? That is one thing you have to do. And nowadays with technology, that's quite doable. The second thing you have to deal with is that such a train, such a question, you have to trust that, right? It shouldn't have a virus, it shouldn't steal my data, I need to have some security and things like that. And we call that infrastructure track. But then you're still not done, because if Stelios sends a train from Leeds to Maastricht, that train doesn't speak Dutch, right? And so I have to make sure that in every, what we call station, every hospital, the data has to be understandable and readable by an application. You don't have the luxury of a human looking at your data anymore. And nowadays that is, of course, called fair data. So data must be findable, accessible, interoperably usable. And you can see this metaphor of trains and tracks and station is obviously a train metaphor that we call the personal health train. So the personal health train is a set of principles for federated learning. Now, this is, so we started this about in 2007, researching the first first things. You have a little YouTube video that you can watch with some more details, but you can see that federated learning, or distributed learning as it was called before, and it's exploding. And it's now very much an active research field. And not just a research field, it's actually an active field. So here we have a list of the companies that we know on the right-hand side that provide, or at least are working on, federated learning solution. And I see, even I know Philips has one as well that's even missing on the list, right? And these different initiatives and companies, the different pros and cons. But the message here is that this is quite mature technology and ideas nowadays that is very doable. I'll give you an example of how such a thing works, right? Suppose you have here 6 DIGICORE members that have patients, and what you see here is their age. So Maastricht has 2 patients, and Frankfurt has 7. And if you want to, for instance, you might want to have a question, what is the average age of, suppose these are lung cancer patients. So what's the average age of the lung cancer patient that we have in our databases, right? And you can see, well, there are 34 of them in the table, and the mean age is 68.2. Right? So how do you federate such a thing? Well, it's actually quite easy, right? Rather than sharing this whole table centrally and calculating the mean, what you do is you calculate the mean in every hospital, so locally, and you count how many patients each hospital has, and then you can employ this very simple formula, and you get the exact same answer. So you, rather than sharing these individual ages, you would share your mean and the number of patients you have, and by that information alone, you can calculate the average age of this complete group. So the message here is, again, you're sharing statistical information, but you're not sharing those individual patients. This is a very simple example, of course, calculating the mean. But we also do much more complicated stuff, where in this federated learning project, we were working with non-small cell lung cancer, outcomes, alive or dead at 2 years, TNM stage, and overall stage. And what we're trying to predict here is can you learn a model, very simple model based on TNM stage that can predict survival or not, right? So that's a logistic regression model. It's slightly more complicated, obviously, than just the average. To give you a feeling about the type of projects that we typically do, so these are 8 centers, and each of them have very different time frames and different inclusion criteria and different treatments. That's all fine, right? We just want to correlate TNM with survival, so don't worry too much about the data that people have. And what we also encounter is lots of different source systems. So we all have our different EHRs, for instance. We have a local one, and then some people have built their own, and in China they're doing something completely different. We all have different ways of combining that data. You can see all kinds of technology here. We have different ways of warehousing our data. But here you see slowly the mapping and the graph database, that's now standardized. And this is how we create fair data, right? So we apply technology to go from all this mess, if you want, all this diversity, to one common data model in each hospital. And that's what we call fair data locally. In this 20K challenge, you can see a lot of bias and differences in data, right? So we are site F, Maastricht, and you can see, for instance, that we also have a lot of missing data. So you can already, from such an overview in each center, can kind of see what's the quality of the data, and you can also see biases, right? So you can see this is us and this is Amsterdam. We're quite similar. This is Shanghai in China, and what you immediately see is that they have very few deceased patients, which are at the bottom, and a lot of alive patients. And the reason is that they only know who is alive and they don't know who's dead in China because they don't have a central death registry. And so if you ask for a complete case analysis, so if you need to know the outcome, you're going to have a bias towards a live patient, which means also lower stages, only N0s, where a more typical population has this variety of N, for instance, like us. And so, you get insights in what the quality of the data at various sites is. In the end, such systems can generate a lot of data points, right? So this was a project which we started and executed in 2 months, and we had 37,000 patients available to us for that learning, right? And so you can see big sites here like NKI 16. This is us 4,000. This is Shanghai, and the other sites are from different parts. You can see you need imputation, you need to do things, a wide variety of date range. So you have different staging systems, for instance, which you have to correct. But in the end, you can get quite a good analysis going. And for those of you that know machine learning, this is an indication of how good such a model is. And the AUC on the right-hand side in this table gives you an indication of if it's 1, it's perfect. If it's 0.5, it's random. But the model predicting survival in all hospitals that we tested it in is better than random, meaning it works. So these are typical examples of projects that we do. You might think, is this all very difficult? Do we need a lot of coding? What about OMOP? Well, so first of all, this is quite mature technology. So there's dashboards there. There are things that you can see. You can see, for instance, which train is executed on my data, which is initiating it, what are the tasks. You can say yes or no to things. We also create fair data stations based on OMOP. This is another project which is in dementia, and you can see that that uses OMOP as its base system, like we would do in DIGICORE, for instance. But this is quite mature and working, and kind of nowadays kind of easy. Key messages, and then I'll shut up. Federation keeps control of data in hospitals and alleviate privacy and other concerns. It's still complex tech, and sometimes very complex math is involved. Don't think it's magic, right? It still requires you to make your own data fair, or at least those data elements, and there's a lot of work in that. Don't worry too much about data quality in the beginning. You can start with very simple data and just get going. And already then you get lots of interesting insights and difference between organizations and publications that we spend. So thank you for that. I'll give the word over to Stelios now, unless somebody has a very urgent question, but we have question time budgeted at the end as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. That was a great presentation. So let me share my screen as well. Can you confirm you can see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Stelios Theophanous, and I'm a real-world data analyst at Leeds Teaching Hospitals. So today I will basically summarize the ATOMCAT-1 and ATOMCAT-2 federated learning studies, which I carried out as part of my PhD at the University of Leeds. First, I will give a brief overview of what anal cancer and outcome modeling are. Then I will talk about the ATOMCAT-1 proof of concept study. And then I will describe how we extended this work further to set up and carry out the ATOMCAT-2 study. So, anal cancer is a rare disease with a rising incidence rate. The disease is more prevalent in females compared to males. And apart from sex, multiple other risk factors have been associated with anal cancer, including HPV infection, HIV infection, and smoking. The current gold standard of care for localized disease involves radiotherapy and concurrent chemotherapy, and surgery is left as a salvage treatment. Studies have shown that this treatment regimen leads to relatively good outcomes. However, chemoradiotherapy leads to numerous early and late side effects, which can impact the quality of life of patients even years after they complete their treatment. And this highlights the need for a more personalized approach to treatment, which will consider each patient's clinical characteristics in order to deliver the right dose for them, in order to minimize side effects while still maintaining the high treatment efficacy that we see. So in order to design more personalized approaches, we first need to identify and understand the baseline factors that affect outcomes after radiotherapy. And to achieve this, we can develop outcome prediction models. So these models are built on the available data that we have on the characteristics of the patients, but also the disease in question, and they can help us estimate the probability of a disease-related outcome. However, the development of prediction models for anal cancer, and this also applies to other rare cancers, is particularly challenging. This is because datasets from a single center are often limited in size, and it can therefore be quite challenging to obtain enough data for robust model training and validation. These cohorts are also usually treated over long periods of time, so the techniques, the radiotherapy techniques used to treat the patients can vary considerably. In addition, ethical considerations and data protection regulations, as Andre mentioned, often limit the sharing of data across centers, which renders multi-center studies very challenging to set up and to conduct in this setting. So in order to overcome these hurdles, we can implement federated learning, which, as Andre explained, is this emerging data analysis technique that allows us to develop models across multiple centers without having to share individual level patient data. And through this approach, we can preserve patient data privacy. So my work on ATOMCAT can be divided into 4 sections. Firstly, carrying out the ATOMCAT-1 proof of concept study, then developing a prospective study protocol for the ATOMCAT-2 study, then establishing a wider consortium of radiotherapy treatment centers, and lastly, using that protocol and the established consortium to carry out the international ATOMCAT-2 study. And this brings us to the aim of ATOMCAT-1, which was to demonstrate the feasibility of conducting federated learning across 3 European centers for anal cancer outcome modeling. So that was a collaboration between the University of Leeds, Maastricht Clinic in the Netherlands, and Oslo University Hospital. To develop the ATOMCAT-1 proof of concept model, we collaboratively selected overall survival as our main outcome of interest, and we chose to analyze 5 pre-selected factors. In the model development phase, we trained and validated a federated Cox regression model, and we first adopted an internal validation approach, and then we carried out a leave one center out validation in order to estimate the extent of the global model's optimism. For the leave one center out validation, we basically trained the model on data from 2 of the centers and then validated on the third, in that case, completely independent data set. And then we repeated this 3 times to cover all the possible combinations. So in total, our model included data from 281 patients that were treated across the 3 centers. And the analysis showed that all 3 cohorts had comparable outcomes, potential follow-up times, and 3-year survival estimates. The results from the global federated Cox regression model, which was trained on all the available data, conveyed that a high-risk disease, a male sex, older age at the start of radiotherapy, and greater primary tumor volume, and a lower prescribed radiotherapy dose are all linked with a worse overall survival. And then the results from the model validation suggested that the model performs consistently well across centers. So overall, the study demonstrated the feasibility of federated learning in this setting in the context of a rare cancer. So after we completed the ATOMCAT-1 study, we then established a prospective study protocol and devised a statistical analysis plan for ATOMCAT-2. In the study protocol specifies the patient population that we wanted to include in our analysis, the definitions of the outcomes that we wanted to explore, and which data items we wanted to collect for each patient. For this specifically, we created a data dictionary to make clear to all participating centers how to record or categorize each data item so that we all have a uniform definition. We also devised a plan on how to deal with any missing data. And finally, we calculated the minimum sample size that would be required for robust modeling. In the statistical analysis plan, we specified our models. So we specified which factors would be included in each. We also described how we aim to develop and validate our models and how we would assess their performance. And lastly, we described how we aim to set up the technical infrastructure that would allow us to carry out the federated analysis. So that prospective study protocol was then shared with a large number of centers across the world that treat anal cancer. And after a few months of recruitment, we finally established the ATOMCAT consortium, which now consists of 14 centers across the UK and 8 European countries. In ATOMCAT-2, we're exploring 3 different outcomes. In addition to overall survival, we're also looking at local regional control and freedom from distant metastases. For each outcome, we identified the most relevant prognostic factors through a systematic review of the literature and in collaboration with clinicians from multiple centers. In our cohorts, we included anal cancer patients treated with radical intent and with conformal radiotherapy. But if patients have had any brachytherapy or any prior pelvic radiotherapy, they were excluded. The number of factors analyzed in our models depended on the sample size calculation and the total number of patients that were available from all the centers. For each of the outcomes, we basically developed and validated one primary model, but we also trained other secondary models in order to explore different categorizations of data items and also to find the effect of other less well-established prognostic factors. We developed the federated Cox regression models using the Vantage6 infrastructure and the VTG.CoxPH algorithm that both of these are open source and freely available online. The model's performance was assessed using Carrel's C-index, and as with ATOMCAT-1, we carried out the leave one center out validation. However, in this project, we might also be able to externally validate our models using data from an Australian center that could not participate in the model training phase. In the first round of analysis, we analyzed a cohort of 1,099 patients treated from 2004 to 2022 across 12 of the consortium centers. In some centers, data in essential data items were missing. And in order to deal with this missing data during the modeling phase, we employed single value imputation for the gross tumor volume and the complete case analysis for all other missing data. The federated models we developed indicate that nodal involvement, male sex, older age, and a larger primary tumor size are prognostic for inferior overall survival. Male sex, a higher T stage, and a larger primary tumor size are associated with inferior locoregional control. And nodal involvement and larger primary tumor size are prognostic for inferior freedom from distant metastases. And as you can see from the C indices here, all models performed quite well, both when internally validated as well as during the LEAP-1 center-out validation. So this is a summary slide and a timeline of our progress to date. In 2021, we published the AtomCAT-1 study demonstrating the feasibility of our approach. Later that year, we established the AtomCAT consortium. In 2022, we published our prospective study protocol and statistical analysis plan in diagnostic and prognostic research, and we also registered those in Open Science Foundation. To set up the AtomCAT-2 study, we received all the ethics approvals required to run the project. We installed the federated learning infrastructure in all participating centers, and we got a collaboration agreement in place across all the centers. And the final analysis run will take place later this month, and we're aiming to submit the manuscript for publication to a high-impact clinical journal. So, in conclusion, AtomCAT-2 will represent the largest series of anal cancer patients treated with conformal radiotherapy techniques. And the results from the study could help us design future clinical trials for anal cancer, which ultimately may help personalized treatment for future patients. Thank you. Okay, so I will now pass this on to Alberto.
Thank you. I'm gonna start sharing my screen. Let's see. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
So thank you for the two speakers to just explain many of the things about federated learning. My name is Alberto Traverso. I'm a medical physicist working in Maastricht and soon also starting in Milan and San Raffaele. I'm going to talk about how you do federation with medical images. Well, the main reason is because, you know, that there's a numeric reason. So medical imaging, you know, is big data. And if we look at oncology, or at least say radiology and radiation oncology, medical images represent the largest amount of data. And of course, you know, this is also of the interest of the companies because, you know, images can also be intended as, you know, any product that we produce as, let's say, process images. The state-of-the-art solution has been basically to, let's say, kind of, I would say, renting a huge space, you know, a storage space, and that's usually some huge server, collect images and try to make some classification of image. This was the Imaging Data Commons effort. As you see, you know, was mainly a radiology-driven collection, many, you know, images coming from multiple disease, of course, led by, let's say, cancer diagnosis. Of course, this is, you know, the traditional way of centralized data. And however, when you work with images, we also have to think that images do not come as labels. You know, clinical data are labels when you train an algorithm. For example, was the patient alive or dead at a certain time point? Images are per se raw data, and usually what we do with images that we process them, we define some region of interest, and then usually this region of interest are input for other studies or machine learning algorithms. For example, you can think about correlating, let's say, the pathology of a tumor based on just the delineation of the tumor on the images. And if you want to let's say, apply artificial intelligence analytics to images, you basically run some algorithms like deep learning, and you try, for example, to detect tumors, like, for example, here in the picture. Of course, if you use this centralized approach, you will need a huge amount of computational power, and you will always be dependent in a certain way on the data you have. So what we decided to do is that we decided to start to show an example of federated deep learning applied to medical images, and we tackle one of the problems that can be, kind of outdated, which is segmentation. So how do you basically segment a target volume, in this case, a gross tumor volume of lung tumors, which can be seen as an input both for classification algorithm as well as for, let's say, treatment planning. So you will always need to delineate the tumor to then define the radiation passing through the tumor. The reason why we do that is also because, as far as I know, in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of development on algorithm to segment tumor. But when you show this AI algorithm to the clinician in one clinic, they can easily spot that these contours does not count for their clinic. And the reason is because there are different guidelines. So we said, can we actually learn a model that is robust and, let's say, makes happy every hospital for clinical use, going beyond the clinical guidelines? So we solved this with deep learning, which is very common for object detection and segmentation. In this ARGOS challenge participated 22 partners, and it was across 10 countries. Now, the reason we decided to do that, it's twofold. The first one is that because we know that institutions have different guidelines, especially if you move from Europe to US or India or China, but also because images look very different. There are different imaging protocols based on the, let's say, protocols that are defined in the clinic. And then, of course, this also meant that you have to go through many different laws, right? You can be, let's say, it can be easier in some countries. In Europe, it can become more different. For example, if you stay in Europe, but you move to Switzerland or UK, and even more difficult when you move to China and India, so outside Europe. And then, of course, the problem with deep learning is that everyone wants to do deep learning, but basically you need to have resources. So if you are, say, a huge, rich hospital, basically you're going to win the game, right? There are hospitals that even when you ask them, do you want to collaborate? They say, well, I have a lot of manpower, I have so much money, many GPUs, more than 1,000 cases, so I'm going to do the deep learning on my own. So this was also an idea of inclusivity. So if I'm a hospital that is very small, that does not have many cases, can I still contribute to have an algorithm that is robust in terms of segmentation and clinical use? So the ARGOS partners that you see, as I mentioned, they were really split across Europe, but around the world. And what is nice is that many of the partners that you see, they are part of this community for rapid learning, which was born, I think, more than 5-6 years ago. So you see that basically it seems as a, let's say, a spin-off of the distributed and federated learning study that have been presented before, showing that really we want to add multiple pieces using imaging with clinical data. How does it work? So there is, again, a central server. This is a bit, let's say, the arbiter, right, that is sending out the application to the nodes. It initiates model training. What does it mean, initiate model training? Is that the weights of the network, a deep learning network, has connections simulating the human brain. It initiates random in the weight. And then there is a parallel training of the model within the different nodes. And then all the results are sending out aggregated. So as I mentioned, again, the data is only processed within the original institution. So it's a fully privacy preserving deep learning solution. You need to do the computation within the local node. So you might need a GPU, but what's the advantage? That if you have 2,000 images, you will have to have, let's say, up to 5-6 GPUs, because your images are 3D vectors. So they are 3D data, very heavy. If you only have 100 data, you can still process that with a very easy workstation. And just to give you an understanding, you can use in clinical practice, for example, all the workstation that we have for radiotherapy planning. Then again, this is a typical aggregated study, so privacy preserving in the sense that only the weights are shared. You don't share individual data, like the imaging data component I showed you before. And then, of course, you know, it is a fully privacy preserving. There is, of course, an architecture to do that. You can use that, decide to solve that as an open source software, but also you can look at commercial solution. Google, NVIDIA even have been working on that. And then the nice thing is that, you know, the problem with these deep learning algorithms is that when you train them on your data and usually you apply them on an external data set, the model performance drops, which usually means people are not happy about the contours you get out of that. A solution is that I can just talk to someone else and say, please give me your data. I'm going to retrain my data, my model on your data. But then, of course, you can imagine you had one multiple center again, the model will fail, right? So this is a way of, let's say, keeping a small amount of local data, but make it working, you know, on a huge amount of data. So for this, let's say, study, we didn't want it to go fancy, you know. The reason is because we were not focusing on technology as many companies do, but we were focusing just on the proofs of concept. And also it was a bit of taking, you know, this, how to say, approach where we wanted to show that if you have good data and a large amount of data, you don't need to go fancy with many deep learning architectures. So we started with the UNet. UNet is very easy. It's called UNet because it reminds a U shape. It goes in the image. Basically, it loses the spatial relation between the images, so looking at the pixel, and then it reconstructs the images, basically reconstructing the target that you want to segment. Two-step, the pre-process step is done on the local data. This is just a lung, so there is any hospital can use their lung segmentation. So you basically identify the lungs in a computed tomography scan, and then you do the federated segmentation of the target volume. It is a fully, how do we federate, right? Because you might imagine that, for example, you might need knowledge on using deep learning. Well, we use, again, Docker. So it's basically a package, you know, I pack my AI, it can connect directly, for example, to XNAT. XNAT is an open source software where you can store your DICOM data. It can even query for data. So, for example, if you have a collection of multiple scans of lung cancer patients, you can just ask, give me, for example, only the planning CT or the diagnosis CT at the time of diagnosis. And then basically you can do this plug and play infrastructure. And then you do your federated learning. And then everything can also be converted into fair data and everything. So if you convert your DICOM database into fair data, you can use the query without knowing, again, the labels that are being used associated with the, for example, the DICOM metadata. So here, just a quick understanding. So as you see, you know, multiple centers participate. So if you are, let's say, lucky and you are in Leeds, for example, you know that you have, let's say, more patients, right, around 400. If you are unlucky, you are a small center, you might have less than 100 patients. Now, usually what happens that if you ask to people, if you ask to someone, can I do deep learning with 100 patients, they will tell you, oh no, well, you are crazy, right? Don't even start to do that. And here the idea is that, you know, when you use two ideas, the first one is that, you know, if you sum all the images, there are two advantages. The first one, your sample size become huge. And the second one is that you have a lot of diversity. And we know that deep learning algorithm tends to overfit. So they tend to work very good on just one category of images, but we know that images are acquired in different ways. Also, if you look at the mean DIGICORE, so how much you agree with the ground truth, basically, you see, you know, that if you take your model pre-trained, there are centers, for example, Cardiff, where probably the model was already pre-trained, and you see that the DICE is pretty high, basically very close to 1. But you see that also in Brazil, the DICE is even below 0.4, which means basically that there is no much agreement. And this is a price you will pay if you just train your algorithm locally and then validate it in our center. So these are the preliminary results of the run. The preliminary results, these are mainly the train loss curve. So the more the curves goes down, the more the model is converging. So you're reaching the optimal solution. It's basically penalized. The farther you are from the ground truth, the more you pay a price. So the loss function, as you see, goes really, really down after 50 cycles. And this is really impressive because, you know, when you train your algorithm locally, usually it will require you even to 200, 300 cycles of iteration. And there are two reasons for that. The first one is that because you are very far from having an optimal heterogeneous data set, so you will pay a huge price when you have small deviation in your validation data set. But also because, you know, you can't fit that much in your GPU many images, so the model has to go really, really slow. So the preliminary results show that basically, you know, when you pull all this data in a federated way, you gain time, but you also gain in terms of stability. Lesson learned about that. Well, the first, which is, let's say, an advantage or a disadvantage, is that, you know, when you work with this federated deep learning with images, you need to work with multiple people because, you know, the medical physicist is, let's say, the person closer to work with images and images acquisition, but you need the radiation oncology because they are the people in a certain way determining the ground truth or, let's say, evaluating the segmentation. And you also need to work with IT and data scientists because, you know, not everyone is, let's say, used to work with GPUs. Also because many hospitals do not have GPU. So the question we got asked very often is, can I still do deep learning if I don't have a GPU, right? It's really difficult because, you know, the advantage is that basically, again, you share aggregates data. So again, this avoids all the problem of related to privacy. But again, another problem is that you need to get really engagement with IRB. So basically, and also you work with multiple countries. Working with images sometimes is more difficult to get, let's say, approval to work with images because sometimes you don't know the outcome you're looking at, right? Compared to work with clinical data. My main point that I also learned is that, you know, considering this is also DIGICORE Masterclass, is that there is the Osiris for DIGICORE for clinical data, which means, you know, we can transform our clinical data into fair data using a common vocabulary. Now, images are very particular. They don't have a vocabulary. They are just a vector of numbers, right? So some people might say, okay, should we standardize the way in which we acquire images? I think this is not possible. So what is not clear really what we can standardize. You know, for example, what happens is Andre showed, you know, in China, there were some data that looked different. For example, TNM stage was a different version, or we're missing patient with a certain stage. Now with images, how do you spot, for example, that some images have contrast and some other images do not have contrast, or maybe some images are, let's say, only with a slice thickness much thicker than other. So I think there is no solution because images against our raw data. I think the way to go there will be also to put some kind of quality assurance based on DICOM metadata, which is the only information we have about images. And I think, as I mentioned, this was a work in progress. In terms of technology, I think the focus here is not on technology because there are many other deep learning solutions available. And NVIDIA has proved that we can go much more, let's say, complicated in terms of the deep learning algorithm. I think what we prove here is that you can do federating learning with images. And I think that the next step will be really to use process imaging, for example, extracting imaging feature, and then pair them with all the studies that you've been showing that were only focusing on clinical data. And I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that. Great talks from all of you. Opening up for questions. You either put your hand up, pop a question in the chat, or just switch your mute off and ask a question. And while you're thinking about that, I've got one to start us off. I'm going to send this one to Andre. So if you wanted to sort of just practically, if you wanted to do install this federated analytics, kind of what has to happen? What technology do you generally advise, and kind of what's the contracting process? Because this is some form of data sharing agreement, I assume.
Yeah, so there are two aspects indeed, right? The technology that you need and the contract. The technology that you need to install it it can be very simple in terms of when we use clinical data, or can be quite complicated when you use images, right? Because they have different compute resources. But generally, we have an onboarding project which is very limited in resources. Basically, you need a laptop that you can install stuff on, right? More is not needed. It's very light in terms of its installation, and it needs to have connection to the internet. That's the only thing you really need. So installation of this whole thing can be done, literally in an hour if you have the right access. That's not difficult at all. But what needs to be done still, of course, is you have to talk to a lot of people in your hospital to get this done, and you need agreements, right? So you need a lot of artifacts for that. You need IRB approval usually to do that. You need IT approval, security approval, privacy officer approval. But we do have lots of documents there to go through that process. But it depends on your internal process how quick that is. In terms of contractual agreement, I mean, you can't still get away with, you still have to have an agreement between the parties, right? In the example of Stelios, right? So he presents a model which can predict survival and low control on this metastasis in anal cancer. You still have to talk about who will be on the paper, who will get that model, right? What is the intellectual property, right? Who will get paid for what? And so those things are very similar if you want to do a centralized system, but they do still have to be agreed on. And that can take anywhere between, it's now very quick in our case, but that can take anywhere from 3 months to 1 year, I guess.
Thank you. Any other questions? Jose.
Thanks, Pierre. I have a question or a comment for Albi. You mentioned that in this federated setup, you don't need to have large amounts of data. So do you see perhaps do you see this federating approach as a way of removing the need for augmenting your data when you have smaller data sets, or do you it still makes sense to augment your data, change the vectors or change the angles so that even with a few only images, you can still get better local models so that you can share them with the federation?
Thank you for the question. So it's a good question. I'm not a 100% deep learning expert. So I always ask my student, why do you augment data? So you rotate them, you flip, or even why do you use deep learning to generate data? So the question I always ask them is it really, data that look close to reality, right? And we did a couple of experiments where we compare, just augmented the data with rotation, flipping, but also generating synthetic data. And the results is that probably it's much better to have a bit more diverse data, works better than just having, let's say, 100 times augmented data from your local data. So it seems to me, of course, where is the right number, right? Well, what do you need? Just is it 100 enough, to local data, summed with all the others to have enough robust argument? My feeling and what we see is that having more diverse data, I can't tell you the percentage, is leads more to general result than just augmenting your data. So it seems so. I would say that augmenting your data is not very, let's say, computational expensive, right? At the end, you just generate more sample. Of course, you need to do your augmentation really precise. So for example, if you augment your data in your clinic because, let's say, sometimes there is a misalignment or there is less contrast, but all the other data set, all the other clinics are very precise in acquiring the images, you will actually do a damage because you are basically augmenting with something that is not, let's say, very representative. I think a good idea to investigate will be probably, again, about talking about the standardization. Try to augment data, generate, let's say, fake sample and see how much the sample looks similar to pulling data from other, let's say, institutions. I think that will give us an idea of how much augmentation is.
Great point of view. I see there's a raised hand. Is that Michaela Riba? Would you like to ask your question, Michaela?
Yeah, fine. Sorry, maybe it's a naive question. I have a question for Stelios regarding the aggregation strategies. I I appreciated a lot the discussion, very interesting. And so I was wondering if you change the way of aggregating data, for example, on a certain variables, okay, for age, I understood, but if you change the statistics on which you aggregate, does this impact on the results? And which is your suggestion about deciding how to aggregate each single data item? Okay, it depends on the data item that you collect. Thank you.
So what do you mean exactly by aggregating it?
I mean, in the first slides, you show that age, for example, could be aggregated using the mean, so the average of the ages. I understand that it's okay. For me, it's easy to understand for the age, but if you add more complicated variables, which is your suggestion about the statistics? Or are there parameters,
So
and which is
let me
the
try the
impact
question
on?
a different way. What are the rules for what types of statistical analysis can be done via federation? So, for instance, can we do just linear equation derived stuff or other forms of statistical analysis?
Right. Yeah. So I think that so the aggregation part is part of the algorithm itself, and it doesn't really have to do with which data items you're using. So like Albi explained, basically the algorithm is broken down into its constituents, where in each center you train the model locally with your own local data. And then you get the aggregated statistics, which are, let's say, the model coefficients, the beta coefficients of a model. And then those aggregated statistics are then sent back to the central server, where basically they're aggregated together with all other centers. And then this is an iterative approach, where if the model errors are not small enough, then the new model is sent back again to each of the centers, and we have another training run where the model is updated again, it becomes a bit better, and then it performs a bit better, and then sent back again for an aggregation across the entire consortium, basically. Does that answer your question?
So thank you. It's a deep learning approach. I mean, it's not another thing starting from aggregated data. I mean, so thank you.
So there's different things there, Michaela. So one of the things when I was looking up the literature, if you imagine, always the question you always decides, how do I get a Kaplan-Meier curve out of this? So maybe let's take it that way. How would we get a Kaplan-Meier curve? Let's make it. We want to do outcomes research. We want to benchmark our outcomes between institutes. We've got different mixes of patients by their risk. So we've got to do some risk normalization. How would we develop a risk normalized Kaplan-Meier curve as a sort of an example of an aggregated statistic?
Yeah, maybe in general, right? I will answer the question that there is, so for the average example that I showed, it's very easy, right? You can write out the formula. How do you do this, right? For more complex models, like just regression or Kaplan-Meier curves of Cox models or all that stuff, right? There's definitely math involved and iteration involved to get to the same model as you would get if you would centralize all the data. However, for all statistical and machine learning algorithms that we know, they can be federated and they can be learned in such a way, right? There's a good bottle of wine contest on anyone that can find an algorithm which we can't federate, and it hasn't been won in the past 3 years. So Michaela, it is slightly more complicated than I can explain in the simple average formula, but it can be done, right? It's just math, yeah, and yeah.
Thank you very much.
There are some chat questions as well.
Some chat questions. It looks like there's out there and around the practicalities. So kind of rules of thumb on the smallest number of patients that you can do subgroup analyses on? Is anal about the limit of it? Could we go rarer, I guess is the way of going it. And then, just the audit, QC and training stuff is the ways of sort of spotting dodgy data. And then I think we're probably at the end of time.
I'll take the last question. Maybe you can take the first question, Stelios, right? So I'll take the last question about data traceability. Yes, so it is possible, right? So typically, for instance, in this case of China that I showed, there's a tremendous bias between the Chinese center and the European center, right? You can, if you see this, the first thing you would do is you would call your Chinese colleagues and says, why is that? Why do you only have alive patients, right? We can't believe that all your lung cancer patients are alive, right? That's almost impossible. And so you start the conversation like that. So typically, before we start doing the actual analysis, and I'm sure Stelios will confirm this, we do things like outlier detection, bias detection, imputation, all that stuff between cohorts. And so yes, it is probably we can check that and ask them to see what's going on. Stelios, perhaps you can talk about how can you do it with one patient in every hospital and so forth.
So I think what we did for the AtomCat projects, we basically said that the minimum, the smallest number of patients that we would include in our cohorts would be 40 patients per center. I don't think this is a rule of thumb, but it was a kind of arbitrary number that we said, in order to, first of all, because it takes so long to get a center involved in order to get the collaboration agreement, for them to sign it, and so on. We wanted to only keep the centers that had a lot of data to contribute. Another aspect of that is the privacy preserving aspect, which I don't know if I will explain this really well, but the lower number of patients per center, the higher the risk of identifying these patients or identifying some kind of individual level data from that cohort. So for example, let's say we have an average, the average age of 10 patients. It's much harder to find what the age of one patient would be compared to if we only had an average age between two patients. So as a rule of thumb, the more data from each center, the better. But I don't think that, I think the absolute minimum would be 10 patients per center would be the absolute minimum.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that. Fascinating food for thought before my weekend. I'd like to say thank you very much to our presenters for today. Hopefully it gets you a sense of what's possible as you come up to a very good question from the last one. If there's any sort of follow-up, where can we learn more? If someone could give us a couple of papers or something to sort of circulate, that would be very helpful. Or videos, I believe, now are common. But thank you very much. Very interesting. Look forward to starting to think about how we apply these techniques to new problems in 3 weeks' time at Frankfurt.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.